Hey everybody, APUSH Nation, how you doing? Welcome in to this week's Fireside Chat edition. We are turning the page here in our units, and we're prompting a whole new topic on American imperialism. And what better way to start that theme than to look at a nasty situation that erupted involving the Hawaiian Islands and the then Kingdom of Hawaii and the American government. Just a brief background on Hawaii. Hawaii had been, throughout its history, an autonomous, independent kingdom. It had never, under any point in its history, up until the late 1800s, been subjugated to another country's rule. Hawaii, like most governments at the time, were monarchies, and it was passed down in much of the same way that European monarchies were, through bloodlines and family. The interest of Hawaii for America, and many countries really, was its strategic location in the Pacific Ocean. Hawaii sits, as you guys I'm sure aware, somewhat relatively in the middle of the Pacific. So not only was it a strategic location for possibly building a naval base, but also Hawaii is rich in natural resources like sugar, fruits, and coal. So the United States, and tomorrow we'll really set the case for this, the United States had conquered a continent by the end of the 1890s. The frontier was closed, as Frederick Jackson Turner's thesis argued. And now the United States was looking to set its sights on going big. And when I mean going big, I'm talking about going on beyond the continental United States, looking abroad. Hawaii's strategic importance for the United States, as I briefly mentioned before, dealt not only in natural resources, but as a potential naval base. I can't stress that enough. The United States began to look beyond just Hawaii and was thinking eventually of getting itself involved in a lot of the international affairs that were going on over in China, Southeast Asia, and other parts of East Asia. But in order to do so, the United States needed, of course, to have a base of operations in the Pacific where it could send ships from San Francisco and other parts of California across and through the Atlantic. So, bottom line is, the American government and the American people saw value in Hawaii. The question was, how would the United States act upon its quest to bring Hawaii in as a potential naval base? Now, one of the architects of this theory of Hawaii's naval strategy is a man whose name you need to know, Alfred Thayer Mahan. He was one of the leading naval officers in the United States at the end of the 19th century. And Alfred Thayer Mahan wrote numerous volumes of works of importance that are still widely circulating today in naval colleges and naval strategy around, in not just the American military, but all military theory. And Alfred Thayer Mahan said that in order for the United States to become a world power, it truly needed a base of operations in the Pacific. That America's quest to become a global power depended upon its ability to create a strong navy. And so Alfred Thayer Mahan was a strong voice in the Navy, arguing for the need for a fleet, a strong naval presence in the Pacific. And if that were going to happen, the American government would have to find a way to position itself to get into Hawaii. The American government had kept a close watch on Hawaii for decades. In fact, in the 1850s, the then king of Hawaii even actually asked and spoke to the American government about possibly annexing Hawaii as a territory. But at the time, then Secretary Daniel Webster, we know him very well from the 7th of March speech, Daniel Webster actually blocked this notion at all, saying that it would be too much like colonialization, which we know the American government at the time was not really doing, something that the Europeans had, of course, been doing. But the United States didn't really feature itself in the mid-1800s as being too worrisome about colonization. And keep in mind, this actually moment with Webster is quite significant because it came in 1851 that Webster stated that the United States had no formal interest in Hawaii. But shortly after 1851, we know that Commodore Matthew Perry was knocking on the doorsteps in Japan. So had Webster perhaps looked to angle the United States in there in the early 1850s, our story with Hawaii could be radically different. But nonetheless, for the next 40 years or so, Hawaii maintained itself as an autonomous, independent kingdom. By 1887, however, Hawaii started to lose much of its autonomy as an independent kingdom. And that is due in large part to the aggressive nature of key business leaders from mostly the United States, but also from abroad. And these key business leaders had great interest in Hawaii, as I already mentioned, for its vegetation, its fruit, its sugar, its natural resources like coal. And these business leaders, they fancied themselves and actually took on a name that is somewhat reminiscent of the French Republican Reign of Terror. They called themselves the Committee of Safety. And the Committee of Safety were almost all white business owners, mostly United States, but also European as well, who formed a strong conglomeration of business interests in Hawaii. And their mission was to annex Hawaii, to bring it into American territory, because if Hawaii became an American territory, then these business owners would reap boundless profits. And the Committee of Safety was incredibly strong at influencing politics in Hawaii. And in 1887, there's an incident that is known forever in Hawaiian history as what's called the Bayonet Constitution signing. Hawaii had been a monarchy, and I already established that point. And when you sign a constitution, you realize that you're shifting away from a monarchy and moving it a bit towards somewhat of a Republican-style government. Well, at the time, Hawaii was being ruled by a female monarch. And her name, and part of my pronunciation on this, I do not speak Hawaiian, but I'll do the best I can. Her name was Queen Liliuokalani. Liliuokalani, I believe is actually how it's called. So if I did botch that, I apologize to anyone if that is considered to be offensive. You can Google the name to get the spelling while you guys are watching this. But essentially, these strong-armed businessmen of the Committee of Safety forced the Queen to sign a constitution surrendering much of her power and relinquishing a great deal of autonomy. And the name Bayonet Constitution really comes from what it sounds like. She was forced at gunpoint to sign this constitution in 1887. Okay, so where do we go next from here? Well, shortly after signing this Bayonet Constitution, the Queen of Hawaii really started to see her power diminish. And as her power diminishes, the growth of the Committee of Safety, the business leaders who ran much of the trade and the exports in and out of Hawaii, really grew in power. And that is when, by 1893, so about 6 years after the Bayonet Constitution moment, the Committee of Safety came in full power. And actually, with support from about 100 U.S. Marines, the Committee of Safety orchestrated the arrest of Queen Liliuokalani, and they imprisoned her and eventually had the Queen of Hawaii charged with treason. So let that sink in for a second. Business leaders from the United States and other parts of the world, with the support of roughly about 100 American troops, have the Queen arrested in 1893. And by the way, she was sentenced, found guilty of treason, and she was sentenced to 5 years hard labor and house arrest. This is unheard of. This is very reminiscent of the French Revolution, really, when you think about what happened. Luckily, Queen Liliuokalani did not have her head chopped off like Marie Antoinette and her husband Louis XVI. But here's the point. American imperialism is the theme we're going to run roughshod with the next few days. The interesting part of this whole takeover of the Hawaiian government by the Committee of Safety and strong-armed business leaders was it was not sanctioned in any way by the American government. Not at all. In fact, two presidents, Benjamin Harrison, who was serving at the very end of 1893, formally stated on record that the United States had no interest whatsoever in annexing Hawaii. But the Committee of Safety tried very hard to lobby President Grover Cleveland, who came back, as we know, was elected in 1892 for a second term, came back. And President Grover Cleveland was pressured very heavily by these business leaders and other members of the United States to annex Hawaii. Cleveland refused. So two presidents in a row, whether Republican or Democrat, refused to annex Hawaii. However, Cleveland was overturned. His decision was eventually overruled, and the House of Representatives and the Senate voted to eventually annex Hawaii. What that means now is that Hawaii is considered to be an American territory. And Queen Liliuokalani, the one who was forced to sign a Bayonet Constitution, the one who was found guilty of treason against her own country, pushed out with the help of a small number of American Marines, who, oh, by the way, were not sent by the American government, but were brought in by these business owners, was forced out of power, and she died in 1917, which was well before Hawaii became a state. But by the time Hawaii was brought into statehood in 1959, over 90% of Hawaii's population voted for statehood. It's a remarkable saga, and in some ways it's truly hard to believe. And I'm telling you, you are going to find yourself asking those questions. Did the United States government really operate this way in imperialism? Was it possible for business owners to actually orchestrate a coup d'etat? And the answer to those two questions is yes. And the saga with Hawaii is only, guys, the starting off point. It's the flashpoint for an entire era where the United States emerges at the end of the century, as a world power. And this is a new territory for the United States, and it cements our legacy moving into the 20th century. So I kept it brief tonight. I'm also going to supplement this with a quick read, and it will kind of recap a lot of the same ideas as well, and it will also get you going on the topics that we'll hit tomorrow, Friday, in class. So I hope you guys have enjoyed this. As always, you know the deal. The past certainly shapes the future. Take care.